Imagine a society that is just, doing everything right.
Yeah, a real success story.
Exactly. You are living in this rapidly modernizing city right at the turn of the 20th century. The municipal government has finally invested in clean drinking water.
A massive public health victory.
Right. They've built these comprehensive modern sewage systems. Public health campaigns are, teaching citizens all about hand washing and basic hygiene.
And it's working, right?
It's working incredibly well. The terrifying rates of cholera and typhoid, the things that just ravaged previous generations, they are plummeting. The city is getting cleaner, wealthier, and supposedly a whole lot safer.
Supposedly being the key word there.
Right, because here is the crazy part. This exact push for sanitation, this absolute triumph of modern hygiene, it actually triggers one of the most terrifying medical crises of the modern age.
It's just wild to think about.
It really is. Suddenly, in the cleanest neighborhoods, among the most, privileged families, children are waking up completely paralyzed.
It is the ultimate public health paradox. Because the very interventions that were designed to protect the population were, they were the catalyst for a totally different kind of catastrophe. And we are talking, of course, about polio.
We are. So welcome to this deep dive into the research packet on polio. And right up front, to you listening, I want to clarify our mission here today.
Yeah, let's set the stage.
Because this is not going to be some standard dusty timeline of a disease that you might just vaguely remember reading about in high school.
No, definitely not.
The goal of this deep dive is to really understand polio as a mirror held up to human civilization. Yes, obviously, it is a story about the intricate, highly vulnerable wiring of the human nervous system.
Oh, biology is fascinating.
It is. But it is equally a story about the really fragile nature of public trust and the paradox of progress. And honestly, it's about the philosophical question of whether humanity can actually finish a massive moral project once that initial visceral panic has sort of faded away.
Because the initial panic always fades. Always. But when it comes to an infectious disease, that final mile of eradication is mathematically and, socially, just the most brutal part of the journey.
Absolutely. So whether you are, prepping for a meeting, trying to catch up on the mechanics of infectious diseases, or if you are just intensely curious about how society functions under extreme pressure and how it occasionally totally breaks down, this deep dive is going to fundamentally change how you view invisible threats.
It really shifts your perspective.
It does. We are going to look at how a microscopic entity shapes the interconnected wiring of our modern world. But to understand how polio managed to terrify the globe, we really have to start with the biology.
We do.
Because this virus is basically a masterclass in biological infiltration.
It really is. I mean, scientifically, polio or poliomyelitis, if we want to use the clinical term, is caused by an RNA enterovirus.
Okay.
And it belongs to a family called Picornaviridae.
Let's break that down a bit, because I know the structure of the virus totally dictates its survival strategy, right?
Exactly. So pico basically means very small.
Okay, small.
And RNA refers to its genetic payload. So it is a tiny, non-enveloped virus.
Wait, so if it's not enveloped, I'm assuming that means it lacks that fragile outer lipid layer that, a lot of other viruses have?
Yes.
Does that make it harder to kill?
That actually gets right to the core of its resilience. You see, many respiratory viruses, like influenza, for example, they have a lipid envelope.
Like a layer of fat.
Right. So if you use soap or alcohol, you literally dissolve that fat layer and the virus just falls apart.
Oh, wow. So hand sanitizer actually works on those.
Exactly. But polio doesn't have that vulnerability. It has this really tough, bare protein capsid.
Like armor.
Yeah, exactly like armor. This armor allows it to survive in incredibly hostile environments, most notably the highly acidic environment of the human stomach.
Ouch. So it just sails right through the stomach acid.
It does. It enters the body through the mouth, usually via contaminated water, food, or hands, survives the stomach acid, and just sets up shop. It starts replicating in the throat and the gastrointestinal tract.
Which means, it's a disease transmitted through the fecal-oral route.
Correct.
It travels through the shared plumbing and sanitation networks of an entire community.
Sure.
And one of the most crucial details in the research packet is about its host range.
This is a huge point.
Yeah, humans are its only known reservoir. There is no animal hiding in the jungle somewhere acting as a backup host.
And that is exactly the biological vulnerability that public health is trying to exploit.
But because it's just us.
Right. Because it is strictly a human-to-human problem, if we can clear it from the human population, it literally has nowhere else to go.
Extinction becomes a mathematical possibility.
Exactly. But this is where the stealth aspect comes in. There is a vast, vast gap between being infected with polio and actually experiencing the catastrophic paralysis we associate with it.
Okay, let's run through the numbers on that because the ratio of infection to paralysis is actually kind of staggering.
It really is. Roughly 70% of people who are infected with poliovirus are completely asymptomatic.
Wait, 70%?
70%. They feel absolutely nothing.
So no fever, no aches.
Nothing. No fatigue, no symptoms at all. They go about their daily lives, interacting with their families, going to work, traveling.
Meaning you have this virus rapidly multiplying in your gut, and you are shedding it into the environment every single time you use the bathroom.
Right.
But you have zero indication that you are a carrier.
None whatsoever. And then another 25% or so experience what clinicians call abortive poliomyelitis.
Which is what, exactly?
It basically presents as a mild, generic flu-like illness. A low-grade fever, a sore throat, maybe some nausea or fatigue.
So it just feels like a cold.
Yeah, it clears up in a few days, and the person just assumes they had a common cold.
Okay, so let me do the math. For roughly 95% of the population, this globally feared pathogen causes either a minor inconvenience or literally nothing at all.
That's the reality of it.
But then we look at that tiny fraction of a percent, the 1 in 200 cases where the virus doesn't just stay in the gut.
Right. In that very small fraction, the virus manages to escape the local lymphoid tissue in the intestines.
It breaches the wall.
Exactly. It breaches the barrier, enters the bloodstream, and from there, it manages to cross the blood-brain barrier and invade the central nervous system.
And once it gets in there, it does terrible damage.
It has a very specific target. It destroys motor neurons, primarily in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and sometimes up in the brainstem.
Okay, I want to make sure we are visualizing this anatomical attack correctly. I was thinking about the nervous system like a massive telephone network.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, so the brain is the central switchboard, and the spinal cord is the main trunk line, carrying millions of cables straight down your back.
Right.
But those cables are basically divided into two distinct bundles, right? You have the sensory cables, which carry incoming calls from the body up to the brain, telling you, something is hot or cold or painful.
Incoming signals.
Exactly. And then you have the motor cables, which are the outgoing dispatches from the brain out to the muscles, telling them to contract or move.
That is a very precise way to look at it. The spinal cord separates those functions.
Okay.
The anterior horn, which is the front part of the spinal cord's gray matter, is specifically the outgoing dispatch center for those motor cables.
So the poliovirus is essentially like a burglar who breaks into the telephone exchange, completely ignores all the incoming sensory lines, and just exclusively targets and destroys the outgoing motor dispatch centers.
Yes, that is exactly what it does. The virus binds to a specific receptor, the CD155 receptor, which happens to be super abundant on these motor neurons.
So it essentially has a key to that specific door.
Right. And once it enters the neuron, it hijacks the cell's machinery to replicate itself. It multiplies until the neuron literally bursts and dies.
Oh, wow.
And this is a really crucial biological reality here. When those central nervous system motor neurons die, they do not regenerate.
Ever.
Never.
Which clarifies a major misconception, I think. The virus isn't actually attacking the muscle tissue itself.
Not at all.
The muscles in a patient's leg or arm are perfectly healthy at the moment of paralysis.
The muscle tissue is entirely viable. It is just sitting there waiting for a command. But the command cable has been severed at the source.
Because the neuron is gone.
Right. And because the muscle receives no electrical signals to contract, it eventually atrophies from severe disuse.
Ah, I see.
This results in what we call asymmetric flaccid paralysis.
Meaning it's not stiff.
Exactly. The limb becomes completely limp, not stiff or spastic. And because the viral destruction in the spinal cord is patchy and kind of random, it often affects one limb or one side of the body much more severely than the other.
And the really haunting part of this whole telephone cable analogy is what it actually means for the patient's daily experience.
Yeah.
Because the sensory lines were totally ignored by the virus.
The sensation remains completely intact.
That is just heartbreaking.
The patient feels everything. They can feel the texture of the bed sheets. They can feel the prick of a needle. They experience pain, heat, and cold completely normally.
So the tragedy is purely motor.
Exactly. They are trapped inside a body that is fully sensory, fully aware, but utterly disconnected from their own command. They want to move their leg, their brain sends the signal, but the signal just reaches a dead end in the spinal cord.
It is a terrifying reality. And because this virus spreads so silently through the plumbing, through the gut, and out into these shared human spaces, its relationship with human environments is just incredibly tight.
Very tight.
But as I brought up at the beginning of this deep dive, as humanity tried to clean up those shared spaces, we accidentally triggered a terrifying new era for this disease.
The sanitation paradox.
Yes.
It remains one of the most profound lessons in the entire history of epidemiology.
Let's really explore the mechanics of this paradox because it challenges literally everything we intuitively believe about public health.
It really does turn it upside down.
Right. So if we look at the late 1800s and early 1900s, this is an era of massive municipal transformation and industrializing nations.
Huge infrastructure project.
Exactly. We're talking about the installation of modern sewage processing, the chlorination of drinking water, the advent of indoor plumbing.
All good things.
All incredibly good things. These interventions are doing exactly what they were designed to do. They are just crushing the mortality rates of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery.
Right.
But suddenly, major epidemics of paralytic polio become highly visible.
And not just visible, but explosively destructive.
The 1916 New York City epidemic is like the textbook example here.
It was devastating.
Over 2,000 deaths in that city alone, over 27,000 cases nationwide. The historical accounts describe absolute panic.
People were terrified.
Parents were literally fleeing the city on trains, trying to smuggle their children past police blockades. So the question is, if the water is getting cleaner, why is a waterborne and fecal-oral virus causing massive epidemics? Was the push for sanitation actually a mistake?
We need to push back firmly on any notion that sanitation was a mistake.
Right, because it saves so many other lives.
Improving municipal hygiene saved millions of lives from other bacterial diseases. What sanitation did was fundamentally alter the timing of poliovirus exposure.
The timing.
Yes, and with polio, timing is literally the difference between invisible immunity and lifelong paralysis.
Walk us through the immunology of that timing then. How does the age of exposure change the outcome so drastically?
Well, in a pre-sanitation environment or in areas with very poor water infrastructure, poliovirus is basically ubiquitous.
It's just everywhere.
It is constantly circulating in the immediate environment. In those conditions, infants are almost guaranteed to encounter and swallow the virus very early in life, often within their first few months.
And at that specific age, infants have a biological shield, right?
Yes, they do. They possess maternal antibodies.
How does that work?
During the third trimester of pregnancy, a mother transfers IgG antibodies across the placenta to the fetus.
Okay.
And then after birth, if she breastfeeds, she passes along secretory IgA antibodies in her milk, which specifically line the infant's gut.
Wow, so the gut is actually armored.
Exactly. If a mother in a pre-sanitation society has been exposed to polio, which she almost certainly has, she passes that temporary immune protection straight to her baby.
So the infant swallows the live wild virus from the environment, but because they have their mother's antibodies circulating in their blood and lining their gut, the virus is essentially neutralized before it can ever reach the spinal cord.
That's it, exactly. The maternal antibodies prevent the catastrophic systemic infection. The infant just experiences a mild, localized gut infection, completely asymptomatic.
They don't even get sick.
Right. But that localized infection is actually enough to teach the infant's own developing immune system how to recognize the virus.
Like a natural vaccine.
Exactly. When the maternal antibodies naturally fade away after 6 to 12 months, the child is left with their own naturally acquired lifelong immunity. The unhygienic environment effectively acted as a continuous, high-risk natural vaccination program.
That is fascinating. But then you introduce clean drinking water.
Right.
You introduce flush toilets and modern sewage, and you sever that early transmission cycle.
You break the chain. infants in these cleaner, wealthier neighborhoods are no longer exposed to the virus during that critical window when they possess the maternal antibodies.
Because their environment is too clean.
Exactly. They might not encounter poliovirus until they go to school or visit a public pool at age 4, 5, or even as teenagers.
By which time, the maternal armor is long gone.
The maternal antibodies have completely vanished, so they encounter this aggressive enterovirus with a completely naive immune system.
And that changes the math.
Drastically. The biological reality of polio is that infection later in childhood or in adulthood carries a significantly higher risk of the virus breaching the gut barrier, entering the bloodstream, and invading the central nervous system.
Why is that?
Well, the immune system overreacts, the viral load spikes higher, and the motor neurons are just left totally exposed.
So fixing one massive gear in the societal machine, waterborne bacterial diseases, accidentally stripped away the invisible immunological armor that was suppressing polio paralysis.
It was an unintended consequence of progress.
We didn't engineer a supervirus. We just created a vulnerable population by delaying their exposure. But because the science of maternal antibodies and asymptomatic spread was not exactly understood by the general public in 1916, society had to invent an explanation for why their kids were suddenly paralyzed.
And human nature abhors a vacuum of explanation.
It really does.
When the biological mechanism is invisible, society fills the void with its own fears, its prejudices, and its moral judgments.
Which, looking at the social fallout of the 1916 epidemic, it's just a grim, recurring theme in history. The virus was spreading silently through asymptomatic carriers of all classes, but the authorities and the public immediately projected the blame onto the marginalized.
They targeted immigrant communities, particularly Italian immigrants in New York.
Of course.
They labeled their crowded neighborhoods as inherently dirty and blamed them as the source of contagion.
Even though the biology says otherwise.
Right. Despite the biological reality that polio was actually striking the wealthier, more sanitized neighborhoods with devastating efficiency, authorities enacted brutal quarantines, they restricted travel, they plastered warning placards on people's homes.
It was just mass panic.
Some cities even launched campaigns to exterminate stray cats and dogs, convinced they were the carriers.
It just reveals how a society under extreme biological pressure will completely default to xenophobia and classism. And the quarantines failed, obviously, because you cannot quarantine an invisible, symptomless spread just by locking down a neighborhood you politically dislike.
It's biologically impossible.
Right. And when prevention failed, and the virus inevitably struck the nervous system, 20th century medicine was forced into a corner. They had to adapt in real time just to keep these patients from dying.
Which brings us to a moment of intense medical improvisation that permanently altered the landscape of modern medicine.
The ICU.
Yes. We have to look at Copenhagen in 1952.
The 1952 Copenhagen epidemic at Blegdom's Hospital. This was an absolute nightmare scenario. We talked earlier about the virus attacking the anterior horn of the spinal cord, paralyzing arms and legs. But in Copenhagen, an unusually high number of patients were suffering from bulbar polio.
Bulbar polio is the most lethal manifestation of the disease.
How does it differ?
Instead of just targeting the spinal cord, the virus attacks the motor neurons in the bulbar region of the brainstem.
Which controls what?
These are the cranial nerves that control the muscles of the pharynx, the vocal cords, and most critically, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles in the chest.
Meaning the muscles required for breathing.
Yes. When the virus severs the command wires to the diaphragm, the patient simply loses the mechanical ability to pull air into their lungs.
Oh, man.
They are fully conscious, their lungs are made of healthy tissue, but the bellows have just stopped working. Without mechanical intervention, they suffocate.
Now, when people think of polio and breathing,
Yeah.
the immediate image is the iron lung. But we need to clarify what that machine actually was, because it didn't cure the disease.
No, it
It
didn't.
didn't repair the nerve damage at all.
Not even a little bit. The iron lung was a negative pressure ventilator. It was essentially a massive, airtight metal cylinder.
Right, you see pictures of these huge tubes.
Exactly. The patient was sealed inside from the neck down, with their head resting outside on a collar. A mechanized bellows at the end of the cylinder would pump air out, creating a vacuum, a negative pressure inside the tank.
So it's sucking the air out around their body.
Yes, and this vacuum physically pulled the patient's chest cavity outward, which expanded the lungs and drew air in through the mouth and nose. When the machine released the vacuum, the chest collapsed back down and the patient exhaled.
It's a mechanical marvel of its time, really.
Yeah.
But in Copenhagen in 1952, the sheer mathematics of the epidemic broke the hospital's capacity.
Completely broke it. Blegdam's hospital was suddenly inundated with over 300 patients suffering from respiratory failure.
And how many iron lungs did they have?
They had precisely one negative pressure iron lung.
One. For 300 patients.
One. The mortality rate for these severe bulbar cases skyrocketed to roughly 87%. For patients who couldn't breathe, a diagnosis was essentially a death sentence within days.
Until a physician named Bjørn Ibsen was brought in for a consultation. And what's wild is that Ibsen wasn't an epidemiologist, he was an anesthesiologist.
And that specific background was critical.
Why is that?
Because anesthesiologists are experts in managing airways during surgery. Ibsen observed the crisis and realized the negative pressure approach was failing, not just because they lacked machines, but because many bulbar patients also lost the ability to swallow.
Oh, because of the throat paralysis.
Exactly. They were drowning in their own secretions, which an iron lung couldn't clear. So he proposed a radical paradigm shift. Instead of encasing the patient in a tank to pull the chest open from the outside, why not use positive pressure to push air directly into the lungs from the inside?
So if the vacuum doesn't work, inflate them like a balloon.
Precisely.
Which is the foundational concept of the modern ventilator. But how did they actually execute that in 1952 when modern computerized ventilators didn't even exist?
Through sheer human endurance.
What do you mean?
Well, Ibsen convinced the surgeons to perform tracheostomies, cutting a small hole directly into the patient's windpipe and inserting a rubber tube.
Okay, so that bypasses the throat.
It bypasses the paralyzed throat and the pooling secretions. Then, they attach a rubber bag filled with a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen to the tube. But because they didn't have machines to rhythmically squeeze those bags, they had to rely on manual labor.
I try to picture the visceral reality of this scene. You have hundreds of patients in a hospital ward, and the only thing keeping air flowing into their blood is a human hand literally squeezing a bag.
The hospital mobilized over 1,500 medical students and volunteers.
1,500?
Yes. They sat beside the beds in shifts 24 hours a day, manually squeezing the rubber bags. Compress, release. Compress, release.
That is unbelievable.
Their hands cramped, their thumbs blistered. They had to constantly monitor the patient's chest rise, their skin color, and their pulse, adjusting the manual pressure minute by minute.
And if they stopped?
If a student fell asleep, the patient would die in minutes.
The physical and logistical toll of that is just staggering. A medical system running entirely on the muscle memory and willpower of teenagers and medical students. Did the intervention actually work?
It was an overwhelming success. By implementing positive pressure ventilation and continuous monitoring, the mortality rate for bulbar polio at Blegdam's plummeted from 87% to roughly 40%.
That's a massive drop.
Huge. But the legacy of this moment extended far beyond polio.
Because it forced a permanent change in how hospitals actually operate.
Exactly. Prior to this, hospitals generally grouped patients by the disease they had, or simply placed them in large open wards.
Right.
But Ibsen's intervention required specialized equipment, dedicated gas lines, and highly trained nurses and doctors providing continuous, intense observation in one centralized location.
You couldn't just spread that out.
No, they couldn't have these patients scattered across the hospital. They had to group the most critically ill together. This organizational shift was the birth of the modern intensive care unit, the ICU.
Wow.
Polio literally reshaped the geography of hospital architecture.
It is an incredible legacy of innovation under pressure. But speaking of geography and the architecture of care, there's a glaring, really uncomfortable question about who actually got access to this life-saving innovation and the rehabilitation that followed.
Very important question.
Because when we think of polio rehabilitation in the United States, the dominant historical image is President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Right.
He famously founded Warm Springs in Georgia, this beautiful, serene rehabilitation center with therapeutic thermal pools. But we really have to ask, who is systematically excluded from that picture?
This is a vital part of the narrative. Disease is biologically universal.
Right. It doesn't care who you are.
The poliovirus does not possess a political ideology. It does not care about your race, your bank account, or your zip code. But the human experience of the disease, who gets the ventilator, who gets the physical therapy, who gets to recover with dignity, is deeply socially unequal.
Because Warm Springs, the absolute pinnacle of polio care and the poster child for the American fight against the disease, was a strictly whites-only facility.
It was governed by the brutal realities of Jim Crow laws. Despite the fact that Black communities were also suffering devastating rates of polio, Black patients were barred from the premier rehabilitation centers.
So where did they go?
Their paralysis was treated as secondary or completely ignored by the primary medical institutions.
And it wasn't until 1941 that this began to shift, right? And it wasn't a spontaneous act of goodwill by the medical establishment.
No, it required intense political pressure. Black physicians, activists, and polio survivors successfully lobbied the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis.
Which later became known as the March of Dimes, right? The massive charity founded by FDR.
Exactly. They forced the foundation to acknowledge the disparity and fund a dedicated, state-of-the-art polio center at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, staffed by Black medical professionals for Black patients.
So even in the midst of a terrifying, supposedly unifying national crisis, care was still heavily rationed based on systemic racism and disability politics.
It's a hard truth.
Society was terrified of the virus, but a significant portion of society was unwilling to drop its prejudices to fight it equitably.
Which is a tragic, recurring theme we see across the history of public health. A patient's outcome often depends less on the pathogen they contract and more on whether the surrounding institutions believe their life is worth the investment of treatment.
Right. And knowing that treatment was grueling, that the ICU was a place of last resort, and that rehabilitation was fraught with massive social inequality, the scientific community realized that simply treating polio was a losing battle.
They needed to prevent it entirely.
They couldn't just repair the broken wires, they had to block the infiltrator before it ever entered the building. They raced to build a vaccine. But what's really fascinating is that they didn't just build one. Two different scientists built two entirely different vaccines, relying on completely different biological philosophies.
The great vaccine engineering puzzle. Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin. Their rival approaches basically define the modern history of virology.
Let's break down the mechanics of these two tools. In 1955, Jonas Salk develops the inactivated polio vaccine, the IPV. Then, a bit later in 1961, Albert Sabin introduces the oral polio vaccine, the OPV.
Right.
What are the specific biological trade-offs between these two methods? Let's start with Salk's injected IPV.
Okay, so Salk's IPV uses a killed or inactivated virus.
How do you kill it?
The process involves growing the wild poliovirus in vats and then treating it with formaldehyde.
Like the embalming fluid.
Exactly. The chemical cross-links the viral proteins, essentially freezing the virus in place. It is structurally intact enough that the immune system can recognize its shape, but it is biologically dead.
So it can't cause disease.
It cannot replicate, and therefore it is theoretically impossible for the vaccine to cause polio.
So it's incredibly safe for the individual. You inject it into the muscle of the arm or leg. What happens next inside the body?
The injection triggers a robust systemic immune response in the bloodstream. The body produces circulating IgG antibodies.
So the blood is armed.
Right. If a vaccinated person is later exposed to the wild virus, and that virus tries to cross from the gut into the blood to reach the spinal cord, the immune system SWAT team is waiting.
Oh.
It neutralizes the virus in the blood, the nervous system is heavily shielded.
But there's a massive biological catch regarding where it doesn't protect you.
Precisely. Because IPV is injected into the muscle, it creates very weak mucosal immunity in the gastrointestinal tract.
And remember, poliovirus enters through the mouth and multiplies in the gut.
Exactly. If you are vaccinated with IPV, your spinal cord is safe, you will not suffer paralysis. But the wild virus can still set up shop in your intestines, replicate wildly, and you can shed live, dangerous virus in your stool for weeks.
So IPV is essentially the ultimate personal body armor. It saves the individual wearing it. But it doesn't stop the spread of the virus through the community's plumbing network.
No, it doesn't.
You can be perfectly healthy and still act as a silent link in the chain of transmission. Now, contrast that mechanism with Sabin's oral polio vaccine.
Sabin took a completely different approach. He believed the only way to truly stop the disease was to mimic the natural infection route. His OPV uses a live but attenuated, meaning severely weakened virus,
Well, how exactly do you weaken a virus without killing it?
through a process called serial passage. Sabin and his team took the wild, dangerous poliovirus and infected non-human cells in a laboratory, specifically monkey kidney and testicular cells.
Okay.
The virus replicates, but because it's in a foreign environment, it has to adapt. They took the virus from the first batch of cells and infected a new batch over and over again dozens of times.
So it's evolving in the lab.
Yes. With each generation, the virus became better at infecting monkey cells, but it slowly lost its genetic ability to infect human motor neurons. It essentially forgot how to cause paralysis, but retained enough of its original shape to trigger an immune response.
That is brilliant biological engineering. So you have this weakened amnesiac virus,
Oh.
and the delivery method is completely different, right?
Yeah. Totally different. It is taken orally, usually as a couple of pink drops directly on the tongue, or famously dropped onto a sugar cube.
Right. People remember the sugar cube.
Because you swallow it, the weakened virus goes exactly where the wild virus naturally goes.
Yeah.
The human gut. It replicates in the intestinal lining.
And what kind of immune response does that trigger?
It triggers a...
So synthesizing this, Salk's IPV gives you personal protection but allows community spread. Sabin's OPV gives you personal protection and stops community spread. Plus, it's easier to deliver. Based on that, why wouldn't public health officials just use OPV everywhere, all the time? Why was there ever debate?
Because of the inherent biological risk of using a live virus.
Even a weakened one.
Yes. When the weakened Sabin virus replicates in a child's gut to build immunity, that child sheds the vaccine strain virus in their stool. In a community with high sanitation and high vaccination rates, this isn't an issue. The shed virus hits a wall of immune people and quickly dies out. But if you deploy OPV in a community with very low immunization coverage, where there are many unprotected, susceptible children that shed, live vaccine virus can start finding new hosts.
It can start circulating from gut to gut.
Yes. And as we discussed with RNA viruses, every time they replicate, their genetic copying mechanism makes errors. They mutate.
Oh, I see where this is going.
If that weakened vaccine virus circulates through an unvaccinated population long enough, it can slowly mutate back. It can regain the specific genetic sequences that allow it to attack human motor neurons.
It basically remembers how to be dangerous.
It reverts to neurovirulence.
It's the ultimate double-edged sword. The tool engineered to eradicate the disease actually contains the latent genetic memory to recreate the disease if the tool isn't applied comprehensively.
Exactly.
But before we get deeper into how that biological trap is playing out in the modern endgame, we need to address a historical disaster involving the other vaccine, the Salk-injected vaccine. Because in 1955, the theory of a perfectly safe, dead virus ran headfirst into the reality of industrial manufacturing.
The Cutter incident. It is a defining tragic moment in the history of pharmaceutical regulation.
Set the stage for us. It's April 1955. The Salk IPV has just been declared safe and effective after the largest clinical trial in history. The public relief is just euphoric.
Church bells are ringing.
Right. The government licenses several pharmaceutical companies to rapidly produce millions of doses to meet this massive demand. One of those companies is Cutter Laboratories in California. What went wrong on their assembly line?
The failure was mechanical and procedural. The Salk recipe requires the virus to be completely killed by a specific concentration of formaldehyde over a specific number of days. The liquid has to be perfectly filtered so that individual virus particles are exposed to the chemical.
Okay, that makes sense.
But at the Cutter facility, the glass wool filtration process was flawed.
What happened to the virus?
Instead of a smooth suspension, the virus particles clumped together. Imagine a microscopic ball of viruses.
Like a cluster.
Exactly. The formaldehyde killed the viruses on the outside of the clump, effectively creating a hardened shell. But the wild, fully virulent poliovirus trapped in the center of the clump was protected from the chemical.
Oh, no.
It survived the inactivation process.
And the internal safety testing didn't catch it.
The protocols were vastly inadequate. Cutter's safety tests failed to detect the live virus. As a result, they shipped out lots of vaccine that were fundamentally lethal. They were injecting children with the exact wild, paralytic disease they were desperately trying to prevent.
The fallout was just devastating. Over 160 children were permanently paralyzed, and several died directly as a result of the vaccine. It halted the entire national vaccination campaign while the government investigated.
It was a horrific tragedy, but it is crucial to analyze what this incident actually proved from a systems perspective. The Cutter incident did not prove that Jonas Salk's underlying science was flawed.
The theory was fine.
The biological theory of IPV was sound. What it proved was that scientific theory is utterly dependent on industrial execution. Manufacturing oversight, rigorous quality control, and strict government regulation are not bureaucratic red tape. They are literally life and death infrastructure.
Right. A vaccine isn't just a formula on a chalkboard. It's the stainless steel vats, the filtration membranes, the batch testing, the cold storage. If the regulatory oversight fails at any point in that physical chain, the medical intervention becomes a biological weapon.
And the government responded by fundamentally overhauling vaccine regulation, establishing the rigorous safety testing and lot release frameworks that protect us today.
Which is good.
But the Cutter incident left a lingering scar on the public consciousness. It proved that institutions are fallible. And as the focus shifted from domestic control to global eradication, that institutional trust would become the single most contested resource in the campaign.
Which brings us to the monumental, ongoing effort to wipe this virus off the face of the earth. The Cutter incident showed what happens when a safety chain breaks inside a laboratory. But as the campaign went global, the fight moved out of the lab and into the incredibly fragile, complex geography of human trust.
In 1988, the World Health Assembly resolved to eradicate polio. They launched the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, the GPEI.
A massive effort.
It was an unprecedented coalition involving the WHO, UNICEF, the CDC, Rotary International, and massive national governments. And to give credit where it is due, their progress over the last few decades has been a staggering achievement for human coordination.
Let's look at the numbers. Since 1988, global polio cases have plummeted by over 99%.
99%.
They have prevented an estimated 20 million cases of childhood paralysis. And in a massive victory, wild poliovirus types 2 and 3 have been certified as completely globally eradicated.
That 99% reduction is a triumph. But the reality of epidemiology is that the final 1% is infinitely harder than the first 99.
Why is that?
Because eradication is no longer a biological science problem. We possess the vaccines. We understand the transmission dynamics. The final mile of eradication is entirely a geopolitical, logistical, and sociological problem.
Currently, wild poliovirus type 1 remains endemic in only 2 countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Why is the virus making its final stand there?
Because the virus thrives in systemic chaos. To eradicate polio, you have to vaccinate every single child multiple times to build population immunity.
Right.
But how do you accomplish that in regions defined by active conflict, mass displacement, and rugged, inaccessible terrain?
There is a massive logistical hurdle here called the cold chain. Explain why that makes vaccinating in a war zone so incredibly difficult.
Well, the oral polio vaccine is biologically fragile. It must be kept continuously refrigerated between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius from the moment it leaves the manufacturing plant until the moment it is dropped onto a child's tongue.
It has to stay cold the entire time.
Exactly. If it gets too warm, the live virus dies and the vaccine is completely useless. Now imagine maintaining that unbroken chain of refrigeration while transporting vials on the backs of motorcycles or by foot through the mountainous terrain of the Hindu Kush in 120-degree summer heat, navigating military checkpoints and active insurgencies.
That sounds nearly impossible. If a bridge is blown up by an IED, the vaccinators cannot reach the village.
Yeah.
If a population is forced into a crowded refugee camp with no clean water or sanitation, the fecal-oral route is blown wide open. War doesn't change the biology of the virus, but it completely shatters the infrastructure required to stop it.
But the breakdown of physical infrastructure is only half the problem. The more insidious challenge is the breakdown of communication infrastructure. We have to examine how communication systems and rumors act as social contagion.
I think about it this way. Just as contaminated water spreads the biological virus, contaminated information spreads the behavioral resistance that allows the virus to survive.
That's a powerful way to frame it.
And rumors move vastly faster than a team of vaccinators carrying coolers. If a community fundamentally distrusts the authority delivering the medicine, they will actively hide their children when the health workers arrive.
And we have stark, modern historical examples demonstrating the devastating power of contaminated trust. In 2003, there was a massive coordinated boycott of the oral polio vaccine in 5 northern states in Nigeria.
Let's unpack the context of that boycott, because it wasn't just spontaneous, irrational ignorance.
Not at all. Political and religious leaders in the region began amplifying rumors that the Western-backed polio vaccine was intentionally contaminated with anti-fertility agents designed to sterilize Muslim children, or that it was laced with HIV.
Which sounds wild to outsiders.
Now, to outside observers, this sounded like baseless conspiracy, but you have to view it through the lens of local history. This region was deeply shaped by the legacy of colonialism and Western medical exploitation.
Specifically, the shadows of the Pfizer-Trovan trials in Kano in 1996, where an experimental antibiotic trial during a meningitis outbreak led to deaths and severe disabilities among Nigerian children, followed by years of bitter litigation.
Exactly. When a population has a recent lived historical memory of a Western pharmaceutical intervention causing harm, and then a massive coalition of Western organizations suddenly arrives, urgently demanding that every single child take their medicine.
The rumors suddenly sound like a completely rational, plausible warning.
Yes, the trust had been eroded long before the polio vaccinators even arrived.
And the epidemiological consequence of that boycott was catastrophic. Vaccination coverage plummeted, the virus surged back, and it subsequently reinfected over 20 previously polio-free countries across Africa and the Middle East, setting the global eradication timeline back by years.
It was a massive setback.
But there is a more recent event in the fight for trust. And this one wasn't a rumor fueled by historical anxiety. It was an actual documented intelligence operation.
We have to discuss the CIA's fake vaccination campaign in Pakistan.
And we are going to impartially report the mechanics of what happened here, based entirely on the historical record, because its impact on public health is undeniable. In the early 2010s, during the intense intelligence hunt for Osama bin Laden, the CIA recruited a local Pakistani doctor to organize a fake hepatitis B vaccination campaign in the city of Abbottabad.
And the explicit goal of this medical campaign was not public health. It was espionage.
A cover operation.
It was a cover operation designed to gain access to the compound where bin Laden was suspected to be hiding in order to covertly collect DNA samples from the children living there to confirm his presence.
Now, regardless of the geopolitical or security outcomes of that specific raid, what was the structural impact of using a medical campaign as a Trojan horse for intelligence gathering?
The impact on the global public health apparatus was just devastating. By instrumentalizing a vaccination campaign for espionage, that security operation severely, perhaps permanently, contaminated the supply of public trust in the region.
It broke the unwritten rules.
In areas where foreign medical intervention was already viewed with deep suspicion, this operation basically vindicated the worst conspiracy theories.
It proved the rumor true. It sent a clear message to skeptical communities. You are absolutely right to be paranoid. The people knocking on your door claiming to bring life-saving medicine might actually be gathering intelligence for a foreign military.
And the fallout wasn't merely a statistical drop in vaccination rates. It translated directly into lethal violence. Following the exposure of that operation, legitimate, dedicated polio workers, often local women bravely going door to door to protect the children in their own communities, suddenly became targets.
That's awful.
In both Afghanistan and Pakistan, vaccinators have been systematically threatened, kidnapped, and assassinated because militant groups and fearful communities now viewed them as potential spies.
So when we analyze the geopolitics of eradication, what is the ultimate lesson here for public health institutions?
The lesson is that public health cannot parachute into marginalized, conflict-ridden communities and simply expect compliance based on scientific authority. The syringe is only as effective as the trust the community has in the hand holding it.
The trust has to be there first.
Exactly. Public health must establish its trustworthiness independent of political or military agendas. When that trust is breached, the virus finds the gap and thrives.
And this deficit of trust, combined with war and the logistical nightmares of the cold chain, creates persistent pockets of unvaccinated children. And those specific pockets of vulnerability create the perfect storm for the most complex, frustrating, and dangerous scientific trap in the entire polio endgame.
We are talking about CVDPV, circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus.
We touched on this briefly when we discussed Savin's oral vaccine, but we really need to go deep into the mechanics here because this is the primary threat we are facing right now. There are CVDPV outbreaks happening globally. There was a highly publicized case in Rockland County, New York in 2022 that triggered a state of emergency. We need to be painstakingly clear about what this is because it is incredibly easy for the public to misunderstand.
Clarity is absolutely paramount here. CVDPV does not mean the vaccine gives you polio in a standard setting.
Right.
If you administer the oral polio vaccine to a child in a community where everyone else is vaccinated, that child does not get paralyzed and the community is completely safe. The immunological system works exactly as designed.
The system only breaks down when it is starved of coverage.
Precisely. The trap is sprung when you introduce the live, weakened vaccine virus into a community that has massive immunity gaps, a population with large numbers of unvaccinated people. When a child receives the OPV, they shed the weakened virus in their stool. Because sanitation might be poor or hand hygiene lacking, that weakened virus finds its way into the gut of a neighboring unvaccinated child.
It finds a susceptible host. It replicates in that second child's gut, and then they shed it.
And it passes to a third unvaccinated child and a fourth. It begins circulating. Now, remember the biological nature of RNA viruses. The enzyme that copies their genetic material, the RNA polymerase, is sloppy. It makes constant errors.
That's the mutation rate we talked about.
Yes, the poliovirus genome mutates at a steady rate of roughly 1% per year while it circulates. If this weakened vaccine strain is allowed to spread unchecked from gut to gut for 12 to 18 months, accumulating mutations with every single jump, it can undergo a genetic reversion.
It rewinds the clock.
It essentially unwinds the biological engineering that Albert Sabin did in the 1950s. It regains the specific genetic keys required to bind to human motor neurons.
It reverts to neurovirulence. It is no longer a protective vaccine strain. It has transformed back into a feral, paralyzing pathogen, virtually indistinguishable in its effects from the wild virus.
It's a terrifying loop.
So, logically, if the OPV vaccine can eventually mutate and cause polio outbreaks in these low-coverage areas, why don't we just stop using it? Why doesn't the global health community instantly switch everyone over to Jonas Salk's injected IPV? It uses dead virus, it physically cannot mutate, and it protects the nervous system.
That is the most agonizing dilemma in the eradication endgame. The answer lies in the specific mucosal immunity we discussed earlier. IPV protects the individual's spinal cord, but it does not stop the virus from replicating in the gut and spreading through the community's sanitation system.
So if you stop using the oral vaccine in a vulnerable, low sanitation area while either the wild virus or these mutated vaccine-derived strains are still circulating,
Intestinal transmission will explode. You would lose the only tool capable of actually halting the person-to-person spread. If you switch entirely to IPV, you might protect the children who receive the injection, but the virus would run rampant through the sewage, waiting for anyone who slipped through the cracks.
so you're trapped.
It is a terrifying paradox. If you stop OPV prematurely, the virus surges. But if you use OPV and fail to vaccinate enough children, the vaccine itself mutates and surges.
So how do you defuse a bomb when the tool you are using is also explosive? What is the way out of the CVD-PV trap?
The primary epidemiological solution is, counterintuitively, more OPV vaccination.
Really?
You have to aggressively close the immunity gaps in those communities, so the shed virus hits an immune wall and dies out before it has the 12 to 18 months required to mutate. But simultaneously, science is attempting to engineer a biological escape hatch.
A new tool.
They've developed a new tool, the novel oral polio vaccine type 2, or NOPV2.
Okay, how does the bioengineering of NOPV2 differ from the original Sabin OPV? How do you make a live virus safer?
It involves incredible precision at the molecular level. Virologists mapped exactly which mutations in the RNA sequence allowed the Sabin strain to revert to neurovirulence. They found that a specific structural part of the RNA hairpin loop was highly prone to mutating.
So they focused on that spot.
Exactly. So, using modern genetic engineering, they went into the virus's code and fundamentally stabilized that hairpin loop. They essentially locked the genetic door.
So it's still a live virus, it still replicates in the gut, and it still triggers that massive community-blocking mucosal immunity.
Exactly. But because the genetic code has been artificially locked down, it is vastly less likely to revert to a dangerous form, even if it circulates in a low immunity population for an extended period. It is a targeted technological fix for a specific evolutionary trap.
But even with a genetically stabilized vaccine like NOPV2, we still face the fundamental problem of stealth. If 70% of infections are completely asymptomatic, and the virus is spreading silently through these community immunity gaps, public health officials can't just wait for a child to show up paralyzed at a hospital to know the virus has breached the perimeter.
By then, it's too late.
Right. By the time someone is paralyzed, the virus has been circulating for months. The infiltrator is already in the switchboard room.
Right.
We need a telescope to see into the blind spots.
And right now, the most powerful telescope we have is looking directly into the sewers.
Let's delve into environmental surveillance,
Why?
specifically wastewater testing, because this really feels like the definitive future of tracking infectious diseases globally.
It is an absolute game changer for epidemiology. Because poliovirus replicates intensely in the gastrointestinal tract, infected individuals shed massive amounts of the virus in their stool for weeks, entirely regardless of whether they have any symptoms.
So the evidence is always there.
Therefore, if you want to know if polio has infiltrated a city, you do not wait for the clinical diagnoses. You go down to the municipal wastewater treatment plant. You sample the raw sewage.
So the municipal plumbing network, which historically facilitated the spread of fecal-oral diseases, is now actually acting as an aggregated citywide diagnostic test.
Exactly. By filtering and concentrating samples of city wastewater, laboratory technicians can detect the genetic signature of poliovirus circulating within a population of hundreds of thousands of people long before a single person experiences paralysis.
That's how they caught the Rockland County case, right?
This is precisely how the Rockland County, New York outbreak was mapped. They found the virus in the wastewater of neighboring counties across state lines, revealing a silent transmission network that was vastly wider than the single paralyzed patient suggested.
But the testing isn't just a simple positive or negative result, is it? They aren't just finding a virus. They are identifying exactly which virus it is and where it came from.
That brings us to the power of genomic sequencing. When scientists isolate poliovirus from wastewater, they sequence its entire RNA genome. Specifically, they focus on the VP1 region.
What is the VP1 region and why is it so important?
VP1 stands for viral protein 1. It is a major component of the virus's outer protein shell. This specific region of the genome mutates at a very predictable, steady rate, that 1% per year we discuss.
Oh, okay.
Because it mutates so reliably, the VP1 region acts as a molecular clock.
So by looking at the specific mutations in the VP1 region, you can actually read its history.
Yes, scientists can look at the sequence and confidently state, this is not wild polio from Pakistan. This is a vaccine-derived strain. Based on the number of mutations in the VP1 region, it has been circulating silently for exactly 2.5 years.
The detail is insane.
Furthermore, its closest genetic ancestor was detected in a wastewater sample from London 8 months ago, and before that, in Jerusalem.
That is basically forensic virology. You are tracking the family tree and the global migration patterns of an invisible ghost just by reading the mutations in its armor. Which naturally brings us to the speculative frontier of this surveillance system. Artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
How does AI synthesize this massive global data problem?
Well, AI is custom built for exactly this type of multivariable pattern recognition. The data flow is overwhelming for human analysts. Imagine an AI system that constantly digests real-time genomic sequences from thousands of wastewater treatment plants globally.
Processing it all at once.
It tracks the mutation rates of the VP1 region instantly. It cross-references that genomic data with localized vaccination coverage maps, mobile phone data indicating mass human migration patterns, satellite imagery of sanitation infrastructure, and even sentiment analysis of local social media to pinpoint where anti-vaccine rumors are gaining traction.
So the AI isn't just reacting to an outbreak. It's forecasting one. It could theoretically look at the map and say, there is a massive immunity gap in this specific district. The virus was just detected in the wastewater 50 miles upstream. Cell phone data shows people from that upstream city are traveling to the vulnerable district for a religious festival next week. Deploy a vaccination team to that specific district tomorrow.
It accelerates our situational awareness exponentially. It helps us visualize the invisible network of risk and predict the virus's next move faster than any human epidemiologist could ever manually calculate. It is an incredible technological advantage.
But for all its processing power, can AI solve the trust problem?
No, and that represents the hard, absolute limit of technology in public health. An AI model can draw a flawless map of transmission. It can sequence a viral genome in milliseconds. But an algorithm cannot knock on a door in a village in Afghanistan.
It can't look someone in the eye.
An AI cannot sit in a living room, drink tea with a skeptical mother, listen to her valid fears about foreign medical intervention, and establish human rapport. Polio eradication is, at its core, a human-to-human promise. You can map the virus with silicon and algorithms, but you can only stop it with empathy and trust.
Which brings us to the end of this journey. As we step back and look at the massive grinding machinery of the eradication campaign, it really forces us to evaluate what it actually means to cross the finish line.
To synthesize everything we've unpacked, polio is a microscopic saboteur. It is a tiny, bare strand of RNA that forced human civilization to build global tracking networks.
It completely changed us.
It forced us to reinvent hospital architecture with the creation of the ICU. It drove scientists to engineer brilliant, flawed, and constantly evolving vaccines, and it forced us to grapple with the deadly, tangible consequences of our own systemic inequality, racism, and mistrust.
We have driven it down by 99%. We have pushed this ancient enemy to the absolute brink of extinction. But as we've seen with the sanitation paradox and the CVD-PV trap, almost gone is the most dangerous place to stop. Because the virus is infinitely patient.
It is waiting.
It is just waiting for us to get tired, to let our funding dry up, to allow those immunity gaps to widen just enough to slip back in.
It demands sustained, unglamorous vigilance long after the visceral terror of the iron lungs has faded from our collective memory.
So to you listening, this deep dive is a reminder that in a globalized world, your health is not a private, isolated commodity. It is deeply, fundamentally intertwined with the health of someone living thousands of miles away.
We are all connected by it.
Polio proved that public health is a shared global infrastructure. If the plumbing breaks anywhere, the entire system is at risk.
We are truly only as safe as the most vulnerable among us.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We've seen that the story of polio is a story where a disease is biologically universal, striking motor neuron without prejudice, but the care, the prevention, and the survival rates are deeply socially unequal.
A painful truth.
What happens when humanity cures the next great disease? What happens when we finally develop the definitive cure for Alzheimer's or a universal vaccine for cancer? Will those breakthroughs be distributed based purely on human need? Or will they remain trapped behind the exact same geographical, political, and economic borders that are currently keeping polio alive in its final stubborn inch? It raises the ultimate defining question of modern medicine. Can we ever achieve true biological equality without achieving political equality first?
It is the uncomfortable question that polio forces us to confront every single day.
Because until we answer it, the diagnostic X-ray of our society remains murky. The systemic inequalities remain untreated, and the tiny saboteur is still out there, hiding in the pipes, testing the wires, just waiting to see if we've left the door unlocked.